Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to learn how to do a brake job. We're going to be removing and installing brake pads. I'm also going to show you how to remove and install the rotor. We are using a school vehicle today, so we will be reusing the old parts, but it's a demonstration and you're going to get a chance to see what it looks like to remove the brake components and put it back correctly. All right, see you in a minute. Before we start, we want to make sure we have all of the appropriate tools to do the job. So for this job today, we're going to need a ratchet. We're using a 3/8 extra long ratchet with a swivel head. This vehicle is using a 12mm and 13mm sockets. We also have a bungee cord, or you can use some kind of hook to hang the to hang the caliper so that we're not putting extra tension on the brake hose. And then you're going to use one of three brake caliper compression tools to compress the piston into the caliper. So we'll demonstrate those tools when we have the caliper off.
I'll just go over them.
So we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at the major components in the front disc brake system on this 2001 Chevy Malibu. What you have here, this big round portion, is known as a brake disc or brake rotor. Holding the brake caliper is this caliper bracket, which is bolted to the steering knuckle. And then we have this brake caliper here, which contains the piston that squeezes the pads, which are housed inside of the caliper. So we're going to start out by taking the caliper off, exposing the pads, hanging the caliper from our bungee cord, and then removing our caliper bracket and then the rotor. To gain access to the caliper bolts, I turned the wheel outwards, and you can see we have caliper pin 1 down here towards the bottom and caliper pin 2 up here on top. We're going to remove these bolts and we should be able to slide this caliper off to expose the brake pads. I'm going to use my 12mm ratchet, make sure I'm turning it counterclockwise. Take a minute, because when you're doing brakes, the ratchet's pointing in the opposite direction. So where you stand can confuse you with the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey method. So my pin is rotating in the caliper bracket, so I just had to hold that pin in place. There's my first bolt. I'm going to set it on the lift, and then we'll get the second bolt. So in this case, these pins are slipping, so I'm going to see if I can find a wrench to hold this pin from slipping. Yes. So this caliper pin has 2 flats. So I'm going to put a 16mm wrench on the caliper pin, and then I should be able to finally do the final removal of my caliper bolt. Once I have both bolts off, set my tools aside, get my bungee cord ready. I'm going to wrap my bungee cord like so. There's no perfect way to do this, so whatever works for you is a perfectly fine method. What we want to do is prevent this caliper from hanging and pulling on this hose. So I'm going to give this caliper a little twist to compress the piston a little bit, and then this caliper should slide right off. So once we get that piston pushed in enough by twisting the caliper, I should be able to slide it off the pad here. Still fighting me a little. If you have trouble, these pads have a little pin on them. So if it gives you a lot of trouble, you can use a screwdriver and compress it. There we go. So when you look, you can now see the piston has an opening, and then I can slide this pad off, and that pad has a pin, and that's what was holding the piston in place. So now that we have the pad off and we have the caliper off, we can put our bungee cord to hold this caliper in place. Set it off to the side a little bit there, and then there's our outer brake pad and our inner brake pad. This is a training vehicle, so the brake pads are in good condition, but if the brake pads were worn, this friction material would be very thin, thinner than this backing plate here. The next step, we're going to go ahead and remove this caliper bracket, and then the rotor will come off and give us a chance to machine it or replace it. So I'm going to push my caliper out of the way a little bit here. And then I have my caliper bracket bolts. So I'm going to, again, make sure I'm pushing the right direction. And then these are pretty tight usually, so I got to give it some force. Loosen the top one there. So these bolts are much larger than the caliper pin bolts. And then here comes the caliper bracket. Many times on different vehicles, there's a left and right version of the caliper bracket. So you do want to make sure to do one side of the brakes at a time so that you don't mix up your parts. We'll spend a few more minutes on this component here once we get this rotor off. So if we take a look at the rotor, this has a floating rotor, which means I should be able to grab this rotor and slide it off. And there's your rotor. This is a vented floating rotor. When you buy brake pads, if you buy a premium set, it'll come with new anti-rattle clips and hardware. You can't tell, but on this caliper bracket, there's these stainless steel shims. And what I like to do is I just take a wire brush and I will clean off the brake dust using a wire brush. Now, you definitely don't want to breathe brake dust because it has harmful materials in it. So it's a good idea to maybe wash this with soap and water or hit it with some brake cleaner before this step. But the main idea is you want to get that brake dust and that grime off. You should have a clean, smooth surface for your new brake pads. Some manufacturers do use a little drop of lubricant at each contact point. We'll go ahead and clean each one. Since this is a school vehicle used for instruction, we're just going to clean these parts like so today. If you had new shims, you could simply take these off like by giving them a little pull here. And then your brake kit would come with new ones, and then the new ones just snap right in. Just like so. So now that our caliper bracket is clean, ready. Oh, the next thing we look at on the caliper bracket is these pins. These pins should move in and out freely. These pins allow that caliper to slide left and right to move with the rotor so that we don't have binding brakes. So next I'm going to set our rotor on, our pretend new rotor, and then I'll put this bracket back on, get our pretend new pads on, and go back together. So step one, I like to put the rotor on without touching the friction surfaces. Greasy fingerprints will cause brake noise. Then I'm going to put my caliper bracket on. So a trick I learned, if you have trouble lining up the caliper bracket, is you can put a lug nut to hold the rotor in place. And that'll help you line up your caliper bracket. And you can use your ratchet to run the bolts down. I'm going to snug these now. Every car manufacturer has a torque specification for these bolts, so you will need to look it up on whatever service information website you're using or whatever book that you're using, and be sure to torque these properly. If these comes loose, they're going to make some noise, like you'll hear knocking and popping sounds as this thing shifts around, but ultimately if it breaks off, this is your brakes. This is what stops you. So you could have a potential brake failure if you're not torquing your bolts properly. So the next step, before I get too far ahead of ourselves, we want to make sure that caliper piston is compressed. So I'm going to bring this caliper over here. And I'm going to set this caliper right here like so. And I'm going to take my brake pad and set it in that piston. Go ahead and pause it. So when we install new brake pads, this piston in here needs to be compressed to make sure we have room for, whoops. Oh, we don't want to put that in the video.
No.
So when we're installing new brake pads, we want to make sure that we have plenty of room for the new pad material. So we use a tool like this to compress the piston. Now this piston is compressed a lot because I had to twist it pretty well to get it off the rotor. But if I squeeze this handle, you can see it sucks that piston in, and I just felt it bottom out there. So that's as far as that piston goes in. We do have a couple other options for brake caliper compressor tools. So the other option to compress a piston here is this style, which has a knob and then just a screw. So we can turn that screw down and it'll push the pad in. You normally want to use the old pads when you do this. And this tool is missing a flat, like washer type part that goes on the end to prevent damage to the pad, but I recommend using the old pads when you do this, and then switch it out for the new pad before you install the caliper. And then the other option is you would have both pads in place, and you have this scissor style caliper compressor, which goes here, and then you turn the screw and that scissor opens and also compresses the piston. So there's a few different options for these tools. They all serve the same function. There's a couple of other options. I've seen people use C-clamps and large large channel locks. Those all work, but we always want to do our best to use the right tool for the right job every time if possible. So my next step here is I want to get my my brake pads back in place. So I'm going to hang my caliper one more time so it's not hanging from the hose. You'll notice the difference on these brake pads is this one has this little metal tab. That's a squealer or indicator. What that does is when the brake pads wear down, this will make a squealing sound. Many vehicles, you can see the outside brake pad through the wheel. So I like to put this squeal indicator on the inside if possible. And that'll just tell me if the brakes are worn down on the inside while I'm driving. But you should always have your brakes inspected about every 15,000 miles or every other oil change. So these pads just kind of slip in to the caliper bracket there. And then the next step here, the most important thing when we put this caliper on, is we want to make sure this hose is in the proper orientation. Sometimes what I find is students will rotate the caliper around and then we get a twisted hose, and believe it or not, they can make that fit. So you always want to look at that hose and make sure it's not twisted before you put your caliper back in place. So we're simply going to slide this caliper over the pads, line up our caliper pin bolts, so once I have those caliper pin bolts in place, I'm just going to go ahead and put a wrench on the pin, tighten the bolt. Always to factory specifications, of course. Like I said, I'm just snugging them down. Before I send this car away, I'll put a torque wrench on it. We're going to snug these down. And we have now installed new brake pads. We'll take our bungee out of the spring. You never want to forget that. That can cause trouble down the road. Can rotate our steering back straight so that we can do the other side. And if you install that lug nut, you can remove it, and then you're ready to install the wheel. So the final step after you get your wheels on and you get the car off the jack is you want to get in that car right away, and you slowly want to depress your brake pedal as many times as you need to until you feel that pedal come up and it gets nice and firm. That brake pedal will not perform any braking action if the piston is too far away from that rotor. So when we compress that piston, we've actually taken the pads far away enough from the rotor so that when you step on the pad, the car's not going to stop until you pump that pedal a few times. So number one, before you drive that car, you gotta pump that brake pedal. Just to recap, I had to add a couple of tools if you notice, but we're just going to start over here on your right. This is the brake caliper compressor. This is kind of a quick tool. It's real nice if you do a lot of brake jobs. Your hands don't take the abuse because it's got these nice handles. This is the scissor style here. This works well for several different types of brakes, but it's limited on size. And then this style here, this one's actually one of my favorites. This specific one is actually missing a piece here on the end that is just a flat section to to protect the pads. But I think those used to be about $8 at the auto parts store. Bungee cord or some kind of strap or hook. We had two sockets for this vehicle. It's a 2001 Chevy Malibu. It's a 13 and a 12 millimeter. We had our 3/8 ratchet. Tools that I added, you didn't see me use this. I used this flat blade screwdriver to help me twist that caliper, just to get the piston compressed far enough so I can get the pads out. And then I use a 16 millimeter wrench to hold the caliper pin. And then I use this wire brush to clean the caliper slide plates. So that is the conclusion, replacing brakes on a 2001 Chevy Malibu. Most brake jobs on most cars are essentially the same steps. Please follow, like, subscribe, make a comment. I respond to all my comments as soon as I can. I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Have a good day.